Welcome to this Vital Health podcast. I'm Duane Schulthess, the CEO of Vital Transformation. In January, U.S. Health and Human Services and the Centers for Disease Control made major changes to the childhood immunization schedule, reducing the number of recommended vaccines from 17 to 11. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Christopher Locher, the Chief Executive Officer and co-founder of Versatope Therapeutics, to discuss the current landscape for vaccine manufacturers and innovators. Chris, it's great to see you, sir.
Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure. So if you could just tell me a little bit about Versatope. You were senior director at Vertex before, I'm assuming at a very high level and probably very easy, cozy job, and you've decided to venture off into the very difficult area of vaccines. What was your motivation for doing so?
Well, it was multifactorial, really. So I was in between job opportunities at the time, and I was evaluating different technologies because there's a huge unmet need for not only drug delivery with small molecules like we were doing at Vertex, but also with vaccines and biologics. The delivery component of it really hinders progress, if you will, and therapeutic efficacy. A way to get around that is to have different formulations, material sciences. Nanoparticles, for example, work extremely well with biologics. And I was having a discussion with a professor from Cornell University who I used to work with when I was in San Francisco at the time at the Department of Medicine at UCSF. Dave Putnam, who's at Cornell University, and we were talking about different formulation strategies, and he says, well, I have this nanoparticle technology, do you want to start a company? And I thought, well, okay, I mean, if I don't do it now, I might as well give it a go. And he says, by the way, we have a universal influenza vaccine as well, and it has legs. I mean, we did a study with the CDC, and it looks quite promising. So we launched Versatope. I licensed the technology from Cornell. Wall Street doesn't value infectious diseases because it's not a recurring revenue model. It's a one and done. So you treat somebody with a vaccine, they're healthy, they prevent the disease, and they're not continually buying your product. And the same is true with antibiotics. Once you treat someone with an infectious disease, they're not a recurring subject. When I saw the data for the influenza program, I said, well, this thing has legs. This is a very promising technology. It prevents against pandemic influenza. And when the vaccine efficacy for influenza is less than 50% over the course of, let's say, 13, 15 years, that's an opportunity hiding in plain sight. So I took them up on it. We launched the company. We pulled together a business plan. I went to Mass Bio in Cambridge and eventually ended up here in Lowell because of the opportunity to work with the University of Massachusetts and the Department of Bioengineering. So here we were able to develop a full process for biologics and scale it up and transfer it for manufacturing for human use.
Well, there's a lot there I'd really love to dig into. Okay, I mean, firstly, you mentioned population health, you mentioned AMR. Mm-hmm. You come from Vertex, that is the quintessential orphan disease, mm-hmm. probably the most successful orphan disease company in the last decade at least. Mm-hmm. So what are the challenges between moving from an orphan condition to essentially population health? I mean, we know the challenges with AMR. Mm-hmm. What are you dealing with influenza then, if you're looking at billions of people, populations?
Yeah, so at Vertex, they focus on smaller populations of people, genetic diseases. That was a shift when we changed management there a number of years ago, and primarily when we moved down to South Boston, where the company is located now. They take a single genetic mutation, they design a molecule around it and or a gene therapy, and they're able to correct it. That population size is small, for sure, generally with these rare diseases. What we do is on the opposite end of the spectrum. So influenza kills more than 600,000 people a year. Although we do things on a population level, the platform technology that we use is applicable to both. So you can focus on rare genetic diseases in small populations, or you can focus on large populations. The application of the technology platform isn't partial to one or the other.
It seems your secret sauce, as it were, is you have this ability to put multiple influenza vaccine strains, to go after multiple influenza strain on one particule.
Yes.
This came out of the partnership you have now, the in-licensing that you've done?
With Cornell, yes. They started off with like a prototype vaccine, if you will, with 4 different influenza strains. We focused on a very genetically conserved target called the matrix-2 protein, but it is clinically proven that if you have a drug to it, you'll keep people out of the hospital, you'll keep them healthy, you'll reduce death and disease overall. It's market validated, there's approved drugs for this. So we focused on this genetically conserved molecule, and we took what strains there were, which are about 6 groups that represent the genetic sequence space of this. So we actually have 6 variants, only 6 on Earth.
Only 6.
Only 6. There's other companies doing more. There's a technology out of the NIH that does, I think, 9 variants of COVID, for example, and other respiratory viruses. So you can combine them. But what's unique about us is that we take a biological approach. We genetically engineer and program our proteins, if you will, or our molecules for vaccine efficacy, and we display them on the surface of a small nanovesicle. It has applications not only to multiple strains of viruses that tend to go under antigenic or variations, they have genetic variation, but it's also applicable to diseases like parasites, like malaria. So malaria goes through different stages in the body. There's the infection stage in the liver, there's the blood stage, and then there's the transmission stage in the mosquito. So we can target all 3 and have a tri-specific, if you will, technology with targets that are for each one of these stages. So you can not only help reduce the likelihood of infection, but prevent disease and then break the life cycle in the mosquito as well. With tumors and cancer therapeutics, for example, they also undergo shifts and changes and that kind of thing. So there's some that are relatively conserved, some that are really variable that you can tailor these. So it has addressable applications not only in infectious diseases, but immuno-oncology as well.
You mentioned again AMR when you were making the analogy to what you're trying to do. I mean, you do have multi-spectrum antibiotics that are coming to the market, but they're brutally difficult to fund. Are you seeing similar challenges with vaccination and immunization right now from the standpoint of what you're trying to do? It sounds perfectly logical, but you're right, it's sort of a one and done, and from the market standpoint, it's increasingly difficult. Do you see that analogy holding through? I mean, are you seeing similar problems with immunization as you do with AMR?
Yes. And for that very reason, that it's not a recurring revenue model. So generally you have to be a lot further along in the clinical development spectrum, phase 2 and beyond. I get feedback from investment groups. They say, well, finish your proof of concept study in a human, and show the immune correlator protection. And I mean, when you have those types of very high bars, you're talking about tens of millions of dollars. And that's where the NIH and Health and Human Services come in. So the NIH typically will fund programs through a phase 1 clinical study just to show safety and efficacy in people. But that can cost, well over $10 million just to reach that milestone. And then at a phase 2, you're looking at probably $20 million. So to get private capital to invest in infectious diseases and vaccines, there's a lot of headwind, that's for sure.
What about the challenge then for, when you're looking at population health and outcome studies? I mean, by definition, those are much larger clinical trials as well. Even if you're into 2A or 2B, I mean, there's going to be some high cash requirements. At least on the back of the Inflation Reduction Act, we're seeing large drops in venture capital appetite for startups, particularly in Massachusetts and California, but Raleigh-Durham, Florida. There are some real serious market challenges here and headwinds aside from the indication class you're going after, but also just general conditions from the regulatory pushback we're getting created by the Inflation Reduction Act. I mean, how are you dealing with that right now?
Well, it's somewhat of a mixed picture. I think that the IRA affected small molecule development more than biologics, and especially vaccines. And the reason why is that funding for small molecule development has dropped by about 70% from the private investment community. It's quite large. But vaccines and biologics, with the longer time period, we've actually seen an uptick in sales for things like shingles vaccines.
Sure.
We're up 40%, and DOTAP was almost double in sales because of the Medicare Part D and Medicaid. Overall, the big picture, if you take a step back, small companies like mine have been extremely impacted. And the reason why is because the capital levels and funding levels are amongst the lowest it's been since 2019. In fact, there was only 2 IPOs in Massachusetts last year. It's slim pickings.
What's interesting, if you go back to 2019 and you look at the NASDAQ, 80% of the listings on the NASDAQ were biotech listings.
Yeah.
I mean, it was just huge, and that whole market is just gone. So one of the challenges we're seeing from the standpoint of regulation, specifically with vaccines, and I mentioned this in my introduction, there's a reevaluation of the vaccine schedule. We've gone from the recommendations of 17 HHS was supposed to have a committee meeting. There was a court injunction. We don't have to go into that, the technicality of that ruling and that injunction. But the fact is, they were supposed to be proposing a drop to 11. What do you think would be the impact of such a change if we go from 17 vaccinations to 11 for childhood vaccination programs?
More children will be sick. Some will die. And this is not just me saying that. This is what the data has indicated in repeated studies all around the world. So vaccines are probably our number one protection to safeguard us against infectious diseases. By reducing the schedule to that number, leaves us vulnerable. It's not just, coming at the top down with the administration. They claim that it aligns with European schedules, but there's substantial differences between immunization practices in Europe as well as the United States. So for example, in Denmark, they track every child and they have a very clear record. But if we don't have that in the United States, if we don't have an immunization or a centralized authority that manages that, children will fall through the cracks and immunizations won't happen. And furthermore, you have state legislators now telling school districts that kids don't need to be immunized when they go to school. And that's maybe in one state, and then Massachusetts is a small state, so if somebody moves over to New Hampshire, and
you may have a different schedule.
A completely different schedule. So it leaves the populations vulnerable and children vulnerable, and we're going to see more sick kids on our hand.
I live in Belgium. I'm there 3 weeks a month. It is true that the schedule we're adopting now is more analogous to the Danish childhood schedule. Do you think there is applicability between the US population and the European, such as Denmark or Belgium or France, which do have 11, 12, and 9, I think? Is there some comparability there, or are we just so completely different that you don't think we can draw any conclusions?
There's three fundamental differences. First is childcare. Denmark gives parents a year. A lot of countries, will give a very long
time off.
Time off
Yeah.
after a child is born. That's different in the United States. Some parents don't take any parental leave. The father doesn't, but the mother sometimes does. Maybe they get 8 weeks. And then the kids often go into childcare. So in childcare, they're exposed to diseases that you wouldn't see in Denmark or in Europe, especially diseases like hepatitis B. You can't determine what your caregiver is carrying or not. That's why the early immunization was important here in the United States. And second, Denmark and Europe have centralized registries where they track every child. That's something we don't do in the United States. So by saying that they're comparable, or we want to make it more aligned with that, that central registry is missing. So more kids will not get immunized. And one more thing I want to add is the epidemiology. So like hepatitis A, hepatitis B, these are at much higher frequencies in the United States. So it's not that we're so similar in terms of our demographics, but the epidemiology is quite a bit different in the United States for those certain diseases.
Are we doing enough benefit risk assessment here in the US then related to vaccines? Part of the reason why we've had these proposals is a general belief that we've not been managing the benefit risk of vaccines and we've not been monitoring them. Do you think we're doing enough for the monitoring of the benefit risk calculation on vaccination programs generally? And do the current proposals help or hurt that?
They hurt. And the reason why I say that is because people have to understand the value of rigorous risk assessment, and that the tenet for this, or the fundamental framework, was to give parents more choice. And we're all for more choice, but those are all really good goals. But you can't continually move the goalpost and expect people to have the same information. My point is that I think the most important thing that other studies have found, by the national academies, for example, is that the reporting and the agencies need to have independence. They need that to be free from political changes every few years, or with an election or a politician who wants to change this from the legislators. It has to be scientifically driven. And so unfortunately right now we're actually going in the opposite direction.
It's extremely politicized.
Yeah.
But part of the pushback against this is the 1986 exemption that was put into law about the ability to file lawsuits for damages against vaccination. The actual reason why that was put in place was a lot of manufacturers weren't willing to take on the population risk related to billions of vaccinations. I mean, there's a lot of liability there potentially, particularly if you're going to be liable for any adverse event. And the way the law was structured at that point, you did have a lot of liability there if you didn't have that blanket exemption and people were not willing to create childhood vaccinations as you're trying to do here. Do you think that that's been misunderstood, or is it being mischaracterized?
I think it's being mischaracterized, and I think what it's doing is it's leading to fragmentation of the coordination of the responses we do have, unfortunately. And I think people take like a snippet maybe of truth or of information and then spin it a different way, so you're not getting the full picture. What parents need are consistent messaging and consistent information that is free from political viewpoints and from lawyers who may benefit from a certain stance one way or another.
How much of this controversy around vaccination broadly is due to the rather ham-fisted response we had over COVID?
Oh, it's huge. It's not only just COVID and not just about vaccines, it's anti-science as well. I mean, NIH has been extremely impacted on a lot of levels in a lot of different disease areas. But I think that with COVID, what happened was we had the vaccine passports, we had mandates, we had social isolation, we had the masking. So people were being told to do one thing early in the year, let's say in March, and then they get different guidance in June, and then maybe something different. So they're not going to believe what happens in September. So I think what you're seeing is a pushback, and we needed consistent messaging and communication from people. But the reality was the United States had never been through a pandemic quite like this before. And new information comes in, you have to refine your messaging, and maybe social distancing is, maybe it's not 12 feet, maybe it's 6 feet, and the data has to be shown out, and this was, I don't think, the fault of the NIH or anyone else. People just don't like being told what to do. They need consistent messaging.
There's also a lot of evidence that the CDC was obfuscating a lot of the data. If you went back and looked, you were not able to get the labels of adverse events. You weren't able to see the comorbidity levels by people who were passing away. You were not able to get access to the raw data. You could in England, you could in the Netherlands, you could in Denmark. You could actually pull those data, but you were not able to do it in the US. And when you tried, you had to go through a Freedom of Information Act. I mean, we tried numerous occasions and the data we got was obfuscated. It was very, very difficult. How do you think we can start building back that trust, given the fact that it appears on some levels there was a campaign to not have transparency around the COVID response?
I think they didn't want the information to be misused. I can't speak for them. I was not at the CDC at the time. I think having more transparency would certainly help. Disturbing to think that, that the data was so obfuscated that you couldn't be clear on what you were reading. That's a real disappointment. But at the same time, a lot of times you have to be patient. You have to wait till all the clinical data comes in. You don't want to release information that's half-baked. Let's say it's a subset of a population in one town and could be very different from another town. But generally, before data is released, certainly at a company, you want to have all the data released. You want to have it all thoroughly analyzed and have the whole team weigh in on it so that you can understand what are the nuances and the practicalities of it so that it's honest reporting. I don't think that anything was done deliberately or dishonestly. I think maybe things were delayed. I wasn't there, so it's hard for me to comment on that. But I think to build that trust back, you need clear communication.
You're trying to develop a very innovative platform around a novel technology that basically mimics the microbiome in many ways. We've seen similar applications recently with mRNA platforms, which were initially put into the market for anti-cancer treatments, and then they were very quickly applied to coronaviruses. Do you think mRNA, sort of lumped into the COVID response with this novel technology, has received a mark of Cain unfairly? Because it does seem like there's a lot of opportunity there, and a lot of the science was really promising in cancer. And now we're having a huge pushback against this new technology. I mean, are we becoming sort of Luddites to innovation in some respects for vaccination?
Yeah, I believe so, unfortunately. With $500 million cut in COVID funding, not only impacted COVID research and messenger RNA applications in other disease areas like antimicrobial resistance or anti-cancer therapies, melanoma, non-small cell lung carcinoma. There's studies ongoing now with Moderna and Merck. The results are very encouraging. Yes, unfortunately, it's received a backlash. Now, mRNA work has been, and the science behind it has been in the making for many years. Yes.
Decades.
And so it's safe, for all intents and purposes. They've found that there's really no effect on people actually getting sick from messenger RNA or dying from it, certainly. I think people lack a basic understanding of biology. The stuff that I read, and it floors me how somebody with even just, a middle school biology class would have a better sense of understanding that messenger RNA cannot replicate. In fact, 98% of it is destroyed by the body as soon as it hits it. So you get a very small fraction, just enough like for a vaccine efficacy, and those are the applications where it works well. So in terms of a personalized medicine approach, yeah, absolutely. It's been hit hard. The backlash has hit science overall. Yeah, I hope to see more positive data from cancer studies with mRNA.
There was just a recent article in Stat last week where they'd done a survey and they've seen a 74% drop in new NIH grants. You've mentioned yourself that you were relying heavily for some of your clinical trial platforms to utilize NIH funding. Have you seen drop-offs for what you're trying to do, or has that not been your experience?
Oh no, we've seen huge drop-offs. I've had to lay off most of my team.
Wow.
Yeah. And the clinical studies that we had planned, we stopped them. We got FDA allowance to proceed to the clinic. It was an NIH-sponsored contract, and I got a notification after a 90-day funding freeze on day 89. They said, "We're done, guys. We're canceling the contract for convenience." Now, this went to the courts by states. They canceled a lot of grants and
So
contracts.
you had to go to court on
No,
that.
I didn't
You
go to court, but the states did.
Okay.
So the state of Massachusetts, and I think there were like 20 some states that filed lawsuit that their grants were being cut by the NIH. This was congressionally appropriated money. It was upheld in the courts first time around by a federal judge, and then on appeal as well. So I don't know what's going to happen if it'll go to the Supreme Court now. But those DOGE cuts were not authorized.
Yeah.
And yeah, we've been impacted heavily, and so have a lot of other companies here in the area.
On top of that, we've also had proposals by Secretary Lutnick of the Department of Commerce where they are proposing to take a 50% royalty out of any academic intellectual property that is out-licensed, such as the technology that you have gained. I know from your corporate reports you've received a $450,000 grant to run clinical trial from the NIH. What would happen if, on top of that, you would also then be responsible for a 50% bump in royalties that would then have to go to the federal government on top of all the fundraising you're trying to do? What would be the impact of that?
The $450,000 is just like the first quarter of a mile of a marathon.
Yeah.
It gets you the cell line.
It's the ante at the poker table.
Kind of, yeah. And you'll do a small preclinical study with that
Sure.
money, and that's what we did. You'll get a proof of concept, at the preclinical level. It won't be the tens and hundreds of millions that are required for further clinical development. That's where the rubber really hits the road. A 50% royalty, I think, would gut innovation as we know it. And the reason why is companies wouldn't take it on. I mean, why would you take that on and have that hanging over your head? And certainly pharma wouldn't touch it if they had that type of payment scheme coming up. There's no incentive for us to develop anything.
So you get a patent, you license a new technology. The general consensus that you hear in Washington, and unfortunately with many of the politicians right here in Massachusetts, is that, well, then the government invented the drug. You're just freeloading. What do you think when you hear? So I admit this is a loaded question. But,
well, no, I mean, legally speaking, it's the person who invented it. It's
Yeah.
something that has to be conceived novelly and something that wasn't anticipated or doesn't occur in nature. And this is all done by the scientists in the lab. I mean, I can't tell you what's going to work and what isn't going to work in terms of a very specific composition of matter or a sequence of a gene, this will work and this won't. We have to try a lot of them. And that's where we develop many different constructs, if you will. We make many different products, and we have to screen them all. And in that screening process, we identify one, and oftentimes they are not what we predicted. Case in point is our universal influenza vaccine. We did not expect it to work so well. We took the technology from Cornell, we improved on it, and we wrote our own patent on it. It was just issued. So, and the reason why is because we didn't know that when we designed it, we would have such efficacy that was above and beyond what we originally licensed from Cornell. Now, Cornell has the core technology and the core intellectual property that we license from them, but now we can build on that and create new IP by the innovation that we do as scientists.
Why do you think this is so misunderstood, particularly among the political class right now?
I don't think they're scientists, and I don't think they understand the whole process. I don't think they understand what goes on into the patent process and who conceived of the concept and then put it into practice.
These approaches to intellectual property, the idea that we're going to change march-in rights, that we're going to call in royalties, it seems like for a while, for the last couple decades while these things have been going on, there's been no cost to that. But now it appears there is starting to be a cost. What do you think will happen if politicians continue to attack the sector as they are?
Oh, it'll be offshored. Scientists are leaving now. There was an article in the Boston Globe recently that there's just more incentives overseas. So people are packing up their labs and moving their operations elsewhere. I mean, there's governments actively recruiting folks to come there and set up a shop and do their innovation elsewhere. But that's what's going to happen.
I'd like to go back and discuss a little bit on AMR, antimicrobial resistance again. It seems vaccination could be a really powerful tool against AMR. What do you think should happen to try and facilitate a vaccination-based approach to antimicrobial resistance?
There's companies working on this using technologies that are not unlike Versatope's technology, where you use bacterial vesicles. I think what's going to happen is we're going to get hit really hard, like you said, in the coming years with antimicrobial resistance. But also if you have diseases like influenza that cause pneumonia, and people are prescribed amoxicillin,
penicillin or whatever,
to counteract the bacterial infection that sets in after influenza, then you're going to contribute to microbial resistance. So the more effective influenza vaccines you have, a lot less likely you're going to get pneumonia and require antibiotics to begin with. So I think vaccines are probably our single most underutilized tool to prevent antimicrobial resistance, and just not just bacterial infections, but also fungi as well. And the mechanisms for antimicrobial resistance, those proteins or polypeptides can be used as vaccine candidates. And this is something that our technology could do for E. coli, Klebsiella, Staph aureus for skin infections. So having vaccines, I think, is something that is really important in our arsenal, and this is something we need to be doing now and not waiting until 25 years from now when we have $1 billion or $1 trillion bill from the hospital for all these different resistant infections and people dying right, left, and center.
Everything we've been talking about ultimately boils back to a lack of trust right now in healthcare around vaccination for whatever ham-fisted reasons we want to go into. What do you think needs to happen for us in public health to regain the public trust around a vaccination platform? What would be the recommendations you would make right now to sort of fix this?
Clear communication, I think, is number one. And to build that trust, it happens in the doctor's office, with the physician, with the nurse practitioner, the community health personnel. They need to be provided clear communication tools and clear guidance by the government, not mixed messages. That makes it extremely difficult to inform parents, and I think if they had the structure of that and the short times that they have in their appointments to get the information they need to make informed decisions, I think that trust would be built, one relationship at a time.
Christopher Locher, Chief Executive Officer and co-founder of Versatope. Chris, I wish you all success, sir. It's been really great getting a chance to chat with you.
Thank you for having me.
The executive producer of the Vital Health Podcast is Duane Schulthess. Editing by Caden Drake. The Vital Health Podcast is a production of Vital Transformation, LLC, copyright 2026.